The chandelier above the grand foyer of the Marchetti estate had 47 crystals. Elena Marchetti knew this because she had counted them herself the night her husband, Dominic Marchetti, hung it there as a birthday gift, back when she still believed gifts meant love and not strategy. That was 11 years ago. Tonight, the chandelier blazed at full wattage, throwing fractured light across $300,000 worth of flower arrangements, and a guest list that read like a who's who of the city's most dangerous and most powerful. Elena stood at the top of the curved staircase in a crimson gown, watching her world assemble itself below. She was in her element, ruthless, radiant, untouchable. Mrs. Marchetti, her personal assistant, a nervous young man named Paulo, appeared at her elbow with a tablet. The senator's wife just confirmed, and the Fontaine brothers are on their way up the drive. Good, she did not look at him. Her eyes were scanning the room, cataloging everything, missing nothing. And the catering staff, are they presentable? Yes, ma'am, all in uniform, all briefed. All of them, she turned then just slightly, including the new one, the quiet one. Paulo hesitated half a second too long. Clara, Elena said flatly. The maid, where is she? She is, setting the table in the east wing, ma'am. Elena's lips curved. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent years perfecting the precise calibration of cruelty, enough to land, not enough to leave a mark. She handed Paulo her empty champagne flute and descended the stairs with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who has never once rushed for anyone. She found Clara in the east dining room, alone, arranging silverware with quiet, methodical precision. She was an unremarkable-looking woman, mid-30s perhaps, brown skin, dark eyes, hair pulled back severely. She wore the standard gray uniform of the household staff, and she moved without hurry, without sound, like someone who had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible. She did not look up when Elena entered. Elena stopped in the doorway. Behind her, 3 other staff members lingered. They had followed to watch, as they always did when their mistress descended on someone. Clara, Elena let the name sit in the air. The maid placed a dessert fork. Yes, Mrs. Marchetti. We are having a party tonight, a rather significant one. Elena moved into the room slowly, running one perfectly manicured finger along the edge of the table as she walked. Politicians, business associates, distinguished guests. Yes, ma'am, I've been preparing. Elena stopped and looked at her fully now. You know, I've been thinking, it would be such a shame for you to spend the entire evening hiding back here in the East Wing, missing all the excitement. She paused, and the pause was deliberate, a held note before the punchline. Why don't you come to the party, Clara, as a guest? Behind her, she heard one of the staff swallow a laugh. Clara set down the last fork. She looked up, and for just a moment, just a flicker, something moved behind her eyes. Something Elena could not name and would not remember until it was far, far too late. Wear something decent, Elena added, and the staff behind her broke into smothered laughter as she turned and swept back out of the room. Lord knows you probably don't own anything suitable, but do try. The laughter followed her down the hall. It was a good joke, a clean, harmless joke. Clara stood alone in the east dining room. She looked down at the last piece of silverware in her hand, a knife. She placed it gently on the table. As you wish, she said to the empty room. And the light above her flickered once, then held. If you're enjoying this story, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more than you know, and there's a lot more coming. Keep watching. Rodrigo, the estate's oldest groundskeeper, found Paulo in the kitchen 20 minutes later and pulled him aside with the grip of a man who had seen things he was not supposed to have seen. The woman, Rodrigo said, his voice low and dry as parchment. The new maid. Mrs. Marchetti just invited her to the party. Paulo blinked. As a joke, everyone laughed. Rodrigo did not laugh. His eyes were serious in a way that made Paulo feel suddenly cold despite the heat of the kitchen. There are people in this world, boy, that you do not invite across certain thresholds. You do not offer them entry. You do not say the words. He gripped Paulo's arm tighter. She said the words. She was joking, Rodrigo. The kind of things she is do not understand jokes. He released Paulo's arm and stepped back. God help this house tonight. Paulo stared at him. Then he straightened his jacket, shook off the chill crawling up his back, and walked away, because he was 24 years old and he worked for one of the most powerful families in the country, and old men in kitchens did not frighten him. He thought about Rodrigo's words exactly twice more that night, once when the first glass cracked, once when the doors locked. By 9 o'clock, the Marchetti estate was in full bloom. The grand ballroom glittered. A string quartet played in the corner with the subdued precision of musicians who understood their role was to be heard and not noticed. Waiters moved through the crowd like ghosts, appearing and vanishing at exactly the right moments. 3 senators stood near the bar. A federal judge laughed at something near the fireplace. 2 men who imported things that did not appear on manifests stood near the window, speaking in low voices that meant they were not discussing the weather. Dominic Marchetti stood at the center of it all, as he always did, a large, dark-suited man with silver at his temples and eyes that had never quite learned how to be warm. He shook hands. He laughed at the right moments. He was, as always, flawlessly in control. But he was uneasy. He had been uneasy since 7 o'clock, and he could not say why. He had drunk more than he intended and laughed louder than he meant to, and still the feeling sat low in his chest like a stone that would not dissolve. He scanned the room repeatedly, a habit, a reflex, and found nothing out of place. Elena glided toward him, touching his arm briefly. "Stop looking around like that. You'll make the guests nervous." "I'm not." "You are." She smiled at someone across the room and lowered her voice. "Everything is perfect. Relax." Dominic picked up a fresh glass of scotch. He started to agree. He started to say, "Yes, you're right, everything is perfect." And then the room went quiet. Not gradually, not the slow fade of conversations trailing off. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something has entered it that the room does not know how to contain. He turned toward the entrance. She stood at the top of the 2 steps that led down into the ballroom, and for a moment Dominic Marchetti, who had stared down men with guns and not blinked, simply could not process what he was seeing. The dress was extraordinary. That was the only word for it, and it was not enough. It was deep, architectural black that somehow caught the light wrong or right, in a way that made it appear to move even when she was perfectly still. It fell to the floor in clean, sweeping lines that suggested it had been made for a body, but not necessarily a human one. At her throat, something caught the light, a single stone, dark red, that pulsed with a depth that seemed to come from inside it rather than outside. Her hair was down, her posture was absolute. She looked like someone who had never once in her life been told to be smaller. The string quartet lost their place. 3 separate conversations collapsed mid-sentence. Someone's champagne glass cracked along the base with a clean, precise sound in the sudden silence, and no one even looked at the floor. Elena Marchetti went very still beside her husband. "What," she said softly, "is she doing?" Clara descended the 2 steps into the ballroom, and the crowd parted for her the way crowds part for people they instinctively understand have authority, even when they cannot explain why. A senator's wife touched her pearls. The federal judge's laughter died completely. One of the men by the window turned from his conversation and simply watched, his expression blank with something that was not admiration. Elena forced a laugh. It came out wrong, too high, too brittle. "My God," she said, loudly enough for those nearest to hear. "She actually came." Another laugh. "In that dress, where on earth did she find?" 2 million, said the woman beside her, the wife of a prominent city councilman, a woman who knew fashion the way a surgeon knows anatomy. She was starring. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That is a Valentin Greco original. There are 4 in existence." She turned and looked at Elena for the first time that evening with something other than careful social deference. "Where did your maid get a Valentin Greco original?" Elena had no answer. The room was already moving around her. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a really good time. You do not want to miss what happens next. Within 20 minutes, Clara had become the gravity of the room. It happened without effort, without performance, the way natural phenomena happen, not because they are trying to, but because they cannot help it. The senator who had been holding court near the bar found himself asking her opinion on something he could not afterwards remember. The federal judge's wife introduced herself with both hands outstretched, the greeting reserved for equals. The two men by the window had separated, and one of them was speaking to Clara in a low, urgent voice, and the expression on his face was one no one in the room had ever seen on him before. Fear. Elena watched all of it from across the room, her champagne untouched, her smile gone. Who is she? Her husband appeared beside her. His voice was different now. The unease from earlier had sharpened into something more specific. "She's nobody," Elena said. "She is my maid." She knows Varvara Costello's name, her real name. Nobody outside of 4 people on this earth knows that woman's real name. He was not looking at Elena. He was watching Clara. "How does your maid know that?" Elena did not answer because she had just watched Clara say something to the 2 men by the window that made both of them take a step backward, simultaneously, with identical expressions. And then the one on the left reached up and pressed his hand flat against his own chest, the way people do when something has struck them somewhere internal and fragile. "Dominic, I see it. Who is she?" He said nothing, but Elena noticed, for the first time in 11 years of marriage, that his hand was trembling. Clara found them, of course. She always would have. The crowd seemed to understand this and made way without being asked, and Elena felt the approach the way you feel a drop in air pressure before a storm, not seeing it yet, but knowing. Knowing in the body before the mind catches up. Clara stopped before them. Up close, the dress was even more extraordinary. It did not shimmer in any conventional sense. It moved subtly as though something beneath the fabric was breathing. The stone at her throat caught no light at all now. It simply glowed dark and steady from within. She looked at Dominic. "It has been a long time," she said, "since your family made that deal." The words hit him like a closed fist. Elena watched the color leave her husband's face entirely, not fade, leave in the space between one breath and the next. She had seen Dominic Marchetti be shot at. She had seen him sit across a table from men who wanted him dead and drink his coffee without his hand shaking. She had never seen him look like this. "I don't know what he started." "You do." Clara's voice was entirely calm. It was the calmest voice Elena had ever heard. "Your grandfather started it, your father continued it, you inherited both the benefits and the terms." She tilted her head only slightly. 23 years of unbroken power. No rival who moved against you survived. No deal you needed fell through. Every judge, every contract, every expansion. She paused. "You thought that was talent." The chandelier above the ballroom flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. The room went still again, but it was a different stillness now, charged and wrong, the kind of stillness that precedes something that cannot be undone. "Who are you?" Elena's voice came out smaller than she intended. Clara looked at her then, and Elena Marchetti, who had not been frightened of anything in 15 years, felt something move through her like cold water. "You invited me in," Clara said simply. "You remember. You stood in the doorway of the east dining room and you said the words, 'As you wish.'" Something shifted in the air around her. "I've been waiting a very long time for someone in this house to say those words." "That was a joke." Elena's voice cracked on the last word. "I don't do those." What happened next, the guests would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe. Not because it was beyond language, but because language felt inadequate, felt embarrassing, felt like trying to capture a hurricane in a paper cup. The doors of the ballroom sealed. Not dramatically, not with a boom, they simply became, between one moment and the next, doors that would not open. The string quartet stopped mid-note and did not start again. The lights dropped to something amber and insufficient. And Clara seemed to grow, not physically, not in any way a body can grow, but in presence, in weight, in the quality of space she occupied. "The debt is due," she said, and the words moved through the room like a current. Around them, Elena watched it begin. The senator who had been laughing near the fireplace went suddenly rigid, his eyes open and unseeing, his lips moving soundlessly, and whatever he was seeing, it was not the ballroom. A woman across the room sat down heavily on the floor and covered her face with her hands and began to weep in the dry, heaving way of someone confronting a memory they had buried so deeply they had believed it gone. The two men by the window simply stood and stared at nothing, and tears ran down both their faces, and they did not move to wipe them away. Not everyone, just the ones who had things to pay for. Elena grabbed her husband's arm. "Do something, call someone, you have people." "There are no people for this," Dominic said. He sounded almost peaceful. "I always knew this was coming, I just didn't think," he looked at Clara. "I didn't think it would be tonight." "Then you should not have let your wife issue the invitation," Clara said. Elena wheeled on her. The fear had curdled into fury now, which was the only thing Elena Marchetti had ever done with fear. "You want money? I will give you money. We have more money than you can count. We have properties, influence, offshore accounts." "You paid with those things," Clara said. 23 years ago, those things were the currency. They were delivered." She stepped forward once. "Tonight I came for what remains." Elena felt Dominic's arm go slack in her grip. "Not death," Clara said, reading her face. "Nothing as simple or as clean as death." She looked between them. "Legacy, memory, the record of your existence in the minds of the people who carry your name and your story and your marks on the world. You can't." The deal was specific. Clara's voice had taken on a quality now, layered and resonant, like more than one voice speaking from the same throat. "Power in exchange for legacy. You were always going to end this way. The only variable was when." "My children," Elena whispered. She had not thought of them until this moment, and the thought of them now nearly broke her. They had nothing to do with any of this. "They will remember you," Clara said, and there was something that might in another register have been mercy in the way she said it. That was not part of the terms. They will remember, they will grieve, but they will not carry the debt, only those who benefited. She looked around the room with a gaze that catalogued and settled and moved on. Only those who agreed, even without knowing they had agreed. Dominic reached out and took Elena's hand. She let him because there was nothing else left to do. He looked at Clara. "Will it hurt?" "No," she said. "You will simply become a story that ends." They began to fade at 11:47 p.m. Not all at once, in stages. The way photographs fade, color first, then contrast, then finally the shape of things, until what remains is barely a suggestion of what was. Elena watched her husband's face go first, the specific lines of it softening at the edges, and she reached up to touch his cheek while she still could, and she was surprised at the very end to find that she loved him. She was surprised to find that she loved a lot of things. And then even that thought began to thin. At 12:03 a.m., the doors of the ballroom opened. The guests filed out into the cool night air with the dazed, blinking expressions of people coming out of a film they are not certain they understood. Several of them stood on the steps of the estate and looked back at the grand house and could not quite remember why they had come. The senator's wife tried to recall the name of the hosts and found that the name slid away from her every time she reached for it, like a word on the tip of the tongue that never arrives. The estate itself remained. The chandelier still blazed. The flowers still bloomed in their arrangements. The money was still in the accounts. The properties still existed. But no one could quite remember whose they were. The string quartet packed up their instruments in silence. One of the violinists would later tell her husband that she'd played a party at a large mansion on the hill for a couple she could no longer picture. They had a beautiful house, she would say. I think they were important, but I cannot remember their faces. Her husband would say that was strange. Yes, she would say, it was. Clara walked out of the estate at 12:07 a.m. Her dress had dimmed. Not disappeared, dimmed. The way a fire dims when the wood runs low, something still living at the center but quieter now, needing less. The stone at her throat had gone dark. She moved down the long gravel drive without hurrying, and the night air opened for her the way it opens for things that belong to it. At the end of the drive, she stopped. She looked back at the mansion, blazing and silent on the hill. Somewhere far away in the city, in the lives of people who would wake tomorrow and find that certain names had simply vacated their memories, the world was already adjusting, already sealing over the gap, already forgetting that there was anything to forget. This was how it always went. A promise made is a promise kept. She turned and walked into the dark. 3 months later, a new family moved into the estate on the hill. Young, bright, ambitious. They had come into their money recently and suddenly, in a way they couldn't fully explain, a series of deals that had gone impossibly well, a string of connections that had opened like doors on a windless day. They threw a party in their first week. They hired staff. One of the new maids was quiet, dark-eyed, and calm in a way that unsettled the other staff without them being able to say exactly why. She kept her head down. She did her work without complaint. She had eyes that had seen more than they let on. The new wife of the house found her in the kitchen one afternoon and looked her up and down with the assessing gaze of a woman who had not yet learned what assessments cost. "What's your name?" she asked. The maid looked up. "Clara," she said, and smiled. If this story kept you up watching until the end, thank you. That is exactly what it was made for. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop your reaction in the comments. And if you know someone who would love this kind of story, share it with them tonight. More is coming. Much more.